Secret Life of 3, When Desire is Stronger Than Pain. John stood in the shadows, trying not to breathe too loudly so as not to give himself away. He watched as Matt's hands slowly slid across his wife's body, as he touched her with a tenderness that John hadn't shown Emily in years. Matt leaned in closer, whispering something in her ear, and she smiled, as if this was the most natural moment in the world. His lips brushed against her neck, and Emily closed her eyes, pressing herself against him, forgetting everything else. In that moment, John felt everything inside him begin to boil. A wave of anger surged through him. This was his friend, his wife, and they had betrayed him. He wanted to burst into the room, stop everything, scream, tear off their masks, and shatter their illusion. His heart pounded so loudly, he was sure they would hear him any second. But he stood still, as if rooted to the spot. And suddenly, the anger began to shift into something else. The longer he watched, the more he saw these caresses, these touches, how her body responded to Matt's every move, the stronger a strange, indescribable pleasure rose within him. He couldn't understand where it came from, why he couldn't look away. He should have felt pain, should have been suffering from what he saw, but instead, something inside him was enjoying this moment. It seemed that what was happening didn't hurt him anymore, but rather, captivated him. He watched as Emily gave herself to this moment, and with each passing minute, his anger slowly dissolved, giving way to something deeper, something he had never felt before. Inside him, a conflict raged, between what he believed was right, and what his body and mind craved to continue seeing. Now I will tell you how it all began and how it ended. You will hear a story where the lines between love, betrayal, and unimaginable desire blurred. A story where anger did not lead to destruction but evolved into something darker, something deeper. Our hero found himself in a situation where the world he knew crumbled before his eyes, and instead of running away, he did something that can't be explained in simple words. He stayed. He watched. John sat on the back porch of their suburban home, nursing a beer as the sun dipped behind the hills in the distance. The kids were playing on the lawn, their laughter filling the warm evening air. It was the kind of evening that should have felt perfect. The soft breeze, the smell of barbecues wafting from nearby houses, the hum of sprinklers in the distance. This was the life he had always dreamed of. A family, a home, security. On the surface, it was everything anyone could want. But lately, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, no big fights or screaming matches. Just distance. A subtle shift in Emily's behavior. She seemed distracted more often, her phone always within arm's reach, notifications lighting up the screen when she thought he wasn't looking. There was a time when they'd sit together after putting the kids to bed, sharing stories about their day or just enjoying the quiet. But those moments had become rare, almost non-existent. Now, Emily often excused herself early, claiming she was exhausted, retreating to the bedroom with her phone in hand. He told himself not to worry. People change, don't they? They get comfortable, take each other for granted after years of marriage. That's what he'd heard from friends, from family. It's normal. Still, something gnawed at him, a quiet voice in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. Every time Emily's laughter sounded too forced or her smile too practiced, the voice grew louder. It wasn't just Emily, either. Matt, John's best friend, had been around a lot more lately. Matt had always been part of their lives, a fixture at every family gathering, every barbecue, and every late-night hangout after the kids went to sleep. He was practically family. They had been friends since college, inseparable through thick and thin. But now, whenever Matt was around, John couldn't help but notice the small, subtle glances between him and Emily. The way they seemed to share unspoken words across the room, their smiles too frequent, too comfortable. It was nothing. John told himself that over and over. They were just close. It was normal for friends to be like that, wasn't it? But the doubt had already started to creep in, and once it did, it was impossible to ignore. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, John sat in the living room alone, staring at the flickering glow of the TV, not really watching. His phone buzzed, and out of habit, he reached for it. A message notification from Emily's phone flashed on the screen across the room where she had left it charging. He wasn't the type to snoop, never had been. But something about the way the phone buzzed, the way it felt so out of place in the quiet of the house, made his stomach drop. John hesitated, staring at the phone. His heart pounded in his chest, an inexplicable feeling of dread washing over him. He told himself to leave it alone. But his hands moved on their own, reaching for Emily's phone, unlocking it with a passcode he had known for years but never felt the need to use until now. The screen lit up with a message from Matt. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." A knot formed in John's throat, his mind racing. His eyes stayed glued to the message, as if reading it over and over again might somehow change the meaning. But it didn't. There it was, plain as day. At that moment, 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind. He should be furious, right? He should storm into the bedroom, confront Emily, demand answers. His muscles tensed, ready to explode into action. But something stopped him. The fury, the hurt, it was there, boiling just beneath the surface, but alongside it was something else. Curiosity. What had really been going on between them? How long had this been happening? The questions buzzed in his mind like a swarm of angry bees, but instead of charging upstairs, John found himself frozen in place, staring at the phone. The anger he expected didn't rise. Instead, a different feeling, a sickening intrigue, began to take root. He didn't go to Emily that night. Instead, he waited. John spent the next few days in a haze. The message from Matt replayed in his mind over and over, but he couldn't bring himself to confront Emily. Something inside him held him back, like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Instead, he began to observe. Quietly, without saying a word, he watched Emily more closely, her behavior, her expressions, the way she moved around the house. He noticed every little thing now. How she checked her phone more often, smiling faintly at messages she quickly hid. How she would mention plans with her friends or work commitments but seemed evasive when he asked for details. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and John saw the world through a different lens. Every shared glance between Emily and Matt at their usual gatherings now took on a different meaning. Every time they laughed at something private, every casual touch of the hand, every exchange of smiles, it all seemed like part of some secret language they shared. And the worst part? John didn't feel the anger he thought he would. Instead, he felt a sick, twisted fascination growing inside him. It was wrong, he knew it. He should be furious. He should be planning his next move, hiring a lawyer, confronting them both, ending it all. But instead, he found himself pulled deeper into the web, wanting to know more. One evening, as Emily was in the shower, John couldn't help himself. He unlocked her phone again. It was easier this time, like it had become a reflex. Scrolling through her messages, his breath quickened. There they were, conversations between her and Matt, filled with playful banter and hidden meanings. Some messages were innocent enough, but others hinted at something more. There were inside jokes, flirtatious emojis, and then, there it was, confirmation. A message from Matt sent earlier that week. "I had a great time the other night, we should do it again soon." John's stomach churned, but still, the fury didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange sense of clarity, as if a part of him had always known this was happening, but he hadn't been willing to see it. Now, there was no denying it. The truth was laid bare in front of him. And yet, as he stared at the screen, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Why wasn't he more angry? Why wasn't he reacting like any other husband would? The more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. He didn't want to confront Emily. He didn't want the explosive argument, the accusations, the tears. What he wanted was to see more, to know more. There was a part of him that craved understanding, that wanted to witness it with his own eyes, no matter how painful it might be. And the thought of it, watching from the shadows, knowing everything they thought they were hiding, gave him an unexpected thrill that he couldn't explain it, even to himself. But as he put Emily's phone back in its place and heard the water turn off in the bathroom, John made a decision. He wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. He wanted to see how far it would go. The next week passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. John began to pay even closer attention to Emily's routines. He pretended not to notice when she made excuses to leave the house, always giving vague reasons about errands or meeting a friend. He played along, smiling and nodding, as if nothing was wrong. But deep down, the sick curiosity was growing. He wanted to know what she was doing when she wasn't with him. He needed to know that it didn't take long for him to figure out where Emily and Matt were meeting. They weren't careful enough, and John, with his sharp instincts, pieced it together quickly. One Saturday afternoon, when Emily told him she was going to run some errands, John waited until she left, then quietly followed her. His heart pounded as he drove a few cars behind her, his mind racing with a mix of dread and excitement. He knew where she was going before she even pulled into the parking lot of a small, secluded hotel on the outskirts of town. There was no mistaking it now. This was where it was happening. He parked a safe distance away, his hands gripping the steering wheel, watching as Emily got out of the car, looked around nervously, and walked inside. A few minutes later, Matt's car pulled up, and John watched as his best friend casually strolled into the same hotel. John's breath hitched in his throat, and for a brief moment, he thought about storming in, confronting them both, making a scene. But then, just as quickly, the thought passed. Instead, he stayed in the car, his pulse racing, his mind spinning that he couldn't look away. John left the hotel that night feeling like he had crossed a line he could never come back from. But the weight of guilt that he had expected never came. Instead, there was only a strange sense of liberation, as if by watching them, he had found something new inside himself. He drove home in silence, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. Emily and Matt had no idea he had been there, just a few feet away, witnessing their secret. And that gave John a kind of power he had never known before. The days that followed were almost surreal. On the outside, everything was the same. Emily would smile at him across the dinner table, talk to the kids about their day, kiss him on the cheek before bed. But now, every word, every glance, was laced with hidden meaning. John didn't see her the same way anymore. She wasn't just his wife, she was the woman he was watching, the woman he knew so much about without her ever realizing it. And it thrilled him. He continued to set up more cameras, hiding them in places where he could observe without being seen. It wasn't just about catching them anymore, it was about feeding the strange, twisted need that had taken root inside him. The more he watched, the more he realized that this new dynamic, this secret, voyeuristic control, wasn't something he wanted to end. It was something he craved. He became obsessed with their meetings, waiting for the next time Emily would make an excuse to leave the house, the next time she'd text Matt with plans to meet. And every time, John would be there, lurking in the background, watching from the shadows. But something else began to happen too. As John watched them, as he became more immersed in their secret world, he started to notice a change in himself. The anger that had once burned inside him had dulled to something quieter, something more complicated. He should have felt betrayed, but instead, he felt something closer to curiosity. And with that curiosity came a kind of acceptance. He didn't want to stop them. He didn't want to break apart what they had. He wanted to be part of it. The thought came to him late one night, as he sat alone in the dark, watching the latest footage from the hidden cameras. Emily was getting ready to meet Matt again, her movements casual, unaware of the fact that John was watching every moment. And as he watched, the realization hit him with a force that made him sit back in his chair. He didn't just want to observe them. He wanted to join them. The idea terrified him at first. It was wrong, twisted, something no normal person would ever consider. But John knew he was far past the point of normal. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He had already crossed so many lines. What was one more? In a strange, unsettling way, it felt like the logical next step. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't hurt. He was intrigued. And that intrigue had grown into something darker, something that needed to be satisfied. Over the next few days, John's mind spun with the possibilities. How would he bring it up? How would Emily react? Would Matt even be open to the idea? The thought of confronting them with his proposal both terrified and excited him. But one thing was clear, he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had changed. And now, he wanted more. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One evening, as they sat together on the couch after putting the kids to bed, John decided to test the waters. Emily was scrolling through her phone, her eyes occasionally darting to him as if to check whether he was paying attention. "You've been seeing a lot of Matt lately," John said casually, not looking at her. He could feel her stiffen beside him, her fingers pausing mid-swipe. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. John turned to look at her, his expression calm, almost amused. "You don't have to lie, Emily. I know about you and Matt." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Emily's face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock. "John," the first she stammered, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not angry," he said softly, and the truth of his words hit him even as he said them. "In fact, I've known for a while. And I've been watching." Emily's breath hitched, and she stared at him, not sure what to say. "Watching?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "I've seen everything," John continued, his voice calm, almost soothing. "I know what you've been doing with Matt. And the truth is, I don't mind. In fact, I think I might want to be part of it." The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Emily blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. John felt a strange sense of relief wash over him, as if a burden he had been carrying for weeks had finally been lifted. He had said it. There was no going back now. "John, what are you saying?" Emily finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. John smiled softly, reaching for her hand. "I'm saying that I've been watching you two for a long time. And now, I want to join you." Emily stared at him, her face a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something that John couldn't quite read. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. She pulled her hand away from his, her fingers trembling slightly. "You want to join us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. John nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, though his outward calm remained intact. "Yes," he said quietly, the word hanging in the air like a secret they both hadn't yet processed. "I've been watching for a while now, and I don't feel the way I thought I would. I don't feel angry or betrayed. I feel curious. I feel like there's more to this than just an affair. And I want to explore that. With you. With Matt." Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment, John thought she might run, might burst into tears, or lash out at him. But instead, she just sat there, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she turned away, biting her lip as if weighing the enormity of his words. John felt the tension in the room build to a breaking point. This was it, the moment everything could fall apart or something new could be born. The air between them crackled with uncertainty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily spoke. "I don't know what to say." Her voice was small, fragile. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. How long have you known? John exhaled softly, the truth feeling almost like a release. A few months, he admitted. I followed you once, to the hotel. And then I started watching. Setting up cameras. I know it sounds insane, but once I started, I couldn't stop. I needed to know everything. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with shock and disbelief. You set up cameras? She shook her head, trying to process what he was saying. You've been spying on me? John leaned forward, his voice gentle. I didn't do it to hurt you. I needed to understand. I needed to know what was happening between you and Matt. And the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't about you betraying me. It was about something else. Something I can't explain, but I need to explore it. Emily sat back, her eyes wide and uncertain. I don't know if Matt would, John interrupted her. I'll talk to Matt, he said confidently, as if that were the easiest part of all of this. I just need to know where you stand first. If you're open to it. To all of us together. Emily's breath hitched again, her gaze locking with his. John, this is crazy, she said, shaking her head. I don't even know what to think. He reached out and took her hand again, his grip firmer this time. I know it's crazy. But I've seen the way you look at him. The way you two are together. And I'm not angry about it anymore. I'm curious. I want to understand. I want to be part of it. And I think, maybe you do too. Emily's expression softened, her fingers lightly tightening around his. For the first time since this conversation began, John saw the tension in her face ease, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. She glanced down at their joined hands, then back at him, her lips parting slightly. You really want this? John nodded, his voice steady. I do. I want to try it. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before exhaling slowly. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, her decision made. Okay, she said softly. Let's talk to Matt. The days that followed felt surreal to John. He had expected fear, guilt, maybe even shame to creep in as the reality of what he had proposed settled in. But instead, he felt something else entirely, a sense of liberation, of excitement. This was uncharted territory, something beyond anything he had ever imagined, and the thought of it filled him with an electric anticipation. When he finally met with Matt, the conversation unfolded in a way that seemed almost too easy. They met at a bar, as they often did, and after a few drinks, John carefully broached the subject. Matt's initial reaction was shock, followed by a long, uncomfortable silence. But as John explained, as he laid out the months of observation, the watching, and finally, his desire to join them, something in Matt's expression shifted. Are you serious? Matt asked, his voice low, disbelief coloring his words. John nodded. I've never been more serious. I'm not here to break this up, Matt. I just want to understand it, to be part of it. If you're open to that. Matt took a long sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving John's. He seemed to consider it for a long time, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he set his glass down, leaned back in his chair, and let out a slow breath. All right, he said, his voice calm. If this is really what you want, I'm in. And just like that, the door had been opened. The night they all came together for the first time was unlike anything John had ever imagined. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as they sat in the living room, each of them acutely aware of the line they were about to cross. Emily sat next to John, her fingers nervously twisting a lock of hair, while Matt sat across from them, his face unreadable. For a few minutes, no one said anything, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. John's heart raced, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty swirling inside him. He had brought them to this moment, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this tear everything apart? Would he regret it the moment they crossed that threshold? Or would it unlock something new, something he hadn't even realized he needed? Emily was the first to break the silence. So what now? Her voice was soft, uncertain, as she glanced between John and Matt. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but clear. How do we even begin? John looked at her, then at Matt, his mind racing for the right words. He had been the one to propose this, the one who had pushed them all into this strange, uncharted territory. Now it was up to him to take the next step. We take it slow, John said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. We don't have to rush anything. We just see how it feels. Matt leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. You really want this, John? His tone wasn't mocking, but there was a hint of disbelief in his words, as if he still couldn't quite believe that John was sitting there, asking for this. John nodded. I do. And it was true. As strange as it felt, as out of place as the situation seemed, deep down, John knew that this was what he wanted. The curiosity that had consumed him for months, the dark pull that had driven him to watch, to spy, to obsess, it was all leading to this moment. And now, he was ready. The first touch was hesitant. Emily reached out, her hand brushing against John's knee, as if testing the waters. John felt a shiver run through him, not from fear, but from something else, something raw, unfiltered. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the years of their marriage, the comfort, the familiarity, all seemed to fade away, replaced by something new. Something dangerous. Matt watched them, his gaze steady, as if waiting for permission to join. John nodded, and with that silent signal, Matt leaned forward, his hand resting on Emily's other leg. The energy in the room shifted, the air crackling with an intensity that John had never felt before. It was like stepping off a cliff, into the unknown. There was no turning back now. What happened next was a blur of sensations, emotions too tangled to fully grasp. John watched as Emily responded to Matt's touch, her body reacting in ways he hadn't seen in years. But instead of jealousy, instead of anger, John felt something different, a sense of liberation, as if by giving up control, he had gained something deeper. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of it. Every movement, every whisper, every shared glance, it all felt like a dance, one that they had unknowingly been rehearsing for months. And as the night went on, the boundaries between them blurred, until there was no longer a clear line between husband, wife, and friend. They were all just together. By the time it was over, the room was quiet again, the intensity of the moment slowly ebbing away like the tide. Emily lay between them, her breathing soft and steady, her face relaxed in a way John hadn't seen in a long time. Matt sat on the edge of the couch, his expression thoughtful, but calm. John stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't fully untangle. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did it mean for them going forward? He didn't feel regret. That surprised him the most. He had expected to wake up from this, to be hit by a wave of guilt, of shame. But instead, there was only a strange sense of peace, of contentment. They had crossed a line, but it hadn't shattered their world. If anything, it had brought them closer. As the days passed, what had happened that night wasn't a one-time thing. It became part of their lives, an unspoken agreement between the three of them. Matt continued to visit, but now the dynamic had changed. They no longer hid anything from each other. There was no more secrecy, no more sneaking around. And for John, that was the most freeing part of all. He no longer had to watch from the shadows, to wonder what was happening behind his back. He was part of it, fully and completely. The jealousy he had once feared never came. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into this new reality, where the lines between love, desire, and possession were constantly shifting. But with each passing day, John couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The man he had been before, the husband, the father, the one who had prided himself on control and stability, felt distant now, like a character from a different life. He had stepped into a world where boundaries no longer existed, where the rules of marriage, of relationships, didn't apply in the same way. And while that thrilled him, it also left him with a lingering question: who was he becoming? The curiosity that had first driven him to watch had evolved into something far more complex, something he didn't fully understand. He had embraced this new version of himself, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder how far it would go, and what it would cost him in the end. John's life had shifted in ways he couldn't have imagined. The nights with Emily and Matt became a regular occurrence, slipping into their routine as naturally as everything else. What had once felt like a forbidden thrill now seemed almost normal. The boundaries that once defined his marriage, his sense of self, had eroded entirely. Yet, with each passing encounter, the satisfaction he once found in watching, in participating, began to fade. What had once excited him, now left him feeling hollow. The quiet moments after their nights together, the stillness, the aftermath, were filled with an emptiness that gnawed at him, one that he couldn't quite place. He thought back to when it all started. Back then, the thrill of discovery, the rush of voyeurism, had consumed him. But now, as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Emily slept peacefully beside him, the thrill was gone, replaced by a gnawing void. The question that had been lurking in the back of his mind all along came crashing to the forefront: what now? He had followed the path of his darkest curiosity, crossed every line, indulged every impulse, but now, standing on the other side of it all, he felt nothing. The very thing that had once driven him, that had given him power, had lost its grip. The sense of control, of dominance, had faded into something murkier. He had let go of the jealousy, the anger, but what had replaced it was far worse, a strange, suffocating numbness. He found himself pulling away, emotionally, mentally, from both Emily and Matt. Even during their encounters, his mind would drift elsewhere, no longer captivated by the sight of them together. Instead, he would stare out the window, wondering if this was all there was. How had he ended up here, feeling so disconnected from his own life, from the very people he had once been so obsessed with? One evening, after Matt had left and Emily had gone to bed, John stayed up late, sitting on the couch, a drink in his hand. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wood as the house settled. He stared at the blank TV screen, lost in thought, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything had shifted. The idea of control, of being the one who saw everything, who knew everything, had been intoxicating. But now that he had fully embraced it, he realized just how powerless he truly was. His marriage, his friendship, his sense of self, all of it had been twisted into something unrecognizable. And now, he didn't know how to get back to the person he used to be. He couldn't undo what had been done. There was no going back to the simplicity of ignorance, to the days when he didn't know what was happening between Emily and Matt. He had chosen to dive headfirst into this new reality, and now, he was drowning in it. The next morning, as Emily sat across from him at the breakfast table, sipping her coffee, John looked at her and saw the same woman he had always loved, but different. She was still the mother of his children, his wife, but the intimacy between them had been irreversibly changed. She looked at him and smiled, the same soft smile she had always given him, but it no longer had the same warmth. It was as if they were both pretending, going through the motions of their old lives, even though they both knew they had left those lives behind. "You're quiet today," Emily said, breaking the silence, her voice soft and curious. John forced a smile, shaking his head slightly. "Just thinking," he replied, his tone distant. He wasn't ready to say what was really on his mind, not yet. But the realization was there, hovering over him like a storm cloud. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, John finally broke the silence. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his thoughts. She looked at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" John hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, sinking in slowly. Emily's expression shifted, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Do what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. John sighed, running a hand through his hair, feeling the tension in his chest. "This. Us. Matt. All of it," he said, his voice low. "I thought this was what I wanted. I thought it would give me something I needed, but now I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I've lost myself." Emily's face softened, her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and sadness. "John," she began, but he shook his head, cutting her off gently. "It's not your fault," he said quickly. "I'm the one who pushed for this. I'm the one who wanted to see how far we could go. But now that we've gone there, I don't think I can keep doing this. I need to find myself again. I need to figure out who I am without all of this." Emily looked down at her hands, silent for a long moment. "I understand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've felt it too. The change. The distance." She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "What do we do now?" John stared at her, feeling the weight of her question pressing down on him. He didn't have an answer. For so long, he had been consumed by the thrill of their secret, by the allure of the unknown. But now, standing on the other side, all he could see was the wreckage it had left behind. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But I think we need to take a step back. We need to figure out who we are, without Matt. Without all of this." Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she reached for his hand. "I don't want to lose you, John," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose us." John squeezed her hand gently, his heart heavy. "I don't want to lose us either," he whispered. "But we need to find ourselves again. We need to rebuild. Together." And so, as the silence settled over them once more, John knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not the life they had before, but something different. Something real.